Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this exciting conference. Right, this is my presentation. So you've heard something about life history theory in the previous talks. I'm trying to expand a little bit on that with regard to the understanding of personality disorder, and my clinical work concerns borderline personality disorder. So I'm responsible for an inpatient ward with mainly female young patients with borderline personality disorder. So in my talk, I will also focus quite a lot on borderline personality disorder. But before going into detail, I would like to suggest to you that we have already a quite nice evolutionary toolbox to approach clinical questions in medicine, including psychiatry, like comparative brain evolution, as we've learned in the previous talk. There's a lot of work in evolutionary genetics. Game theory is another interesting area that can be explored in relation to psychopathological signs and symptoms. Ethology was the major topic of Professor Afonso Troisi's presentation. And in my own talk, as already said, I would like to focus on life history theory. And is there a pointer perhaps available? No. So as you can see on the image on the left-hand side, there is huge variation between species in terms of life history strategies. For example, a single mouse can have approximately 100 descendants within 1 year, which is very hard to achieve even for the most prolific human male. And the reason for that is that species differ in their life history, not solutions to their environmental challenges. So there are species who pursue a fast life history, like mice, fishes, and so forth, and others, like humans, but also other primates, whales, and so forth, who pursue a slow life history. The difference is that species with fast life histories have many offspring, but a lot of them perish very soon after birth. And this is totally different in species like ourselves, but also, as I said, primates and whales, also elephants, where the majority of offspring survives until adulthood to procreate themselves. And the new idea developed by Jay Belsky and other evolutionary psychologists almost 30 years ago is that there is also variation within species in regard of life history strategies, whereby the term strategy in no way implies conscious decision making. This is very important to stress when we speak about psychopathology and psychiatric disorders. So if you look at this graph, you see on the left-hand side the so-called, what Belsky and colleagues called the type 1 strategy. So for example, if in families there is high marital discord, high stress levels, perhaps inadequate financial resources, it's more likely that children develop insecure attachment styles, mistrustful inner working models. You see here the association with Bowlby's attachment theory, which, by the way, is a genuine evolutionary theory, but by many not conceived of as an evolutionary theory. And this is mediated by, in many families, harsh and rejected or rejecting insensitive or inconsistent rearing styles, parental rearing styles. And this, more often than not, can lead to an opportunistic interpersonal orientation. Belsky and colleagues distinguished between male behavior, boys' behavior being more aggressive and non-compliant, whereas girls being more anxious and depressed. I will come back to that distinction a little later. But the novel aspect of this idea is that this sort of development has implications for the somatic development. So children growing up under such circumstances are perhaps more likely to sexually mature earlier and enter puberty earlier, and later on engage earlier in sexual activity, lead short-term unstable relationships, and the transgenerational transmission in vertical commas in that regard is that they perhaps tend to limit their parental investment in their own offspring. So this is not a genetic thing, but part of the plasticity that we have. And when you look at the model on the right-hand side, you have the exact opposite. So that's the basic idea, and there is quite a substantial research supporting the idea that the model is true. And together, this is a nice summary of what life history theory is about. It's largely associated with risk-taking behavior because individuals with relatively high expectations should be relatively risk-averse because they have to survive to realize those expectations. But by the same token, individuals with relatively low expectations with regard to future resource availability should be relatively risk-prone because they have very little to lose. That's the idea. So to translate it into psychiatric terms, I would like to come back to one very significant publication by Alfonso Trisi, who has argued that antisocial personality disorder could represent a high-risk strategy, or in other words, a fast life history strategy of social defection associated with resource acquisition and reproduction, where insecure attachment could represent an evolved psychological mechanism that used the quality of parental care received during childhood as a cue for optimizing adult reproductive strategies. As you know, antisocial personality, and especially antisocial personality disorder, is much more prevalent in men compared to women. And I was wondering if borderline personality disorder could be the female equivalent of this kind of strategy, if you like. Now, Marco Del Giudice is a psychologist now working in the United States, originally from Italy. He has approached the entire nosological system in psychiatry from a life history theory perspective, suggesting that one could replace the existing nosological system by suggesting that what we call disorders can be distinguished according to patterns belonging to the fast or slow spectrum. So, for example, in terms of personality traits, conscientiousness and agreeableness are candidates for distinguishing fast and slow strategies. So, for instance, low conscientiousness and low agreeableness would be more likely to be associated with a fast life history strategy, and along similar lines, disinhibition, impulsivity, discounting of future rewards is also more typical for a fast spectrum psychopathology, as well as social antagonism, precocious sexuality, and so forth. This is a similar image summarizing aspects relating to personality, but also temperament and character facets, interpersonal behavior, and neuropsychology, and also cognitive and emotional processing. In addition, I was wondering if we could also relate stress physiology and other biological markers to this idea that people differ in their ways they pursue faster or slower life history strategies, such that perhaps high cortisol levels as a measure of stress, as well as reduced heart rate variability, could be more typical of a fast life history strategy, and also the accumulation of somatic problems also refer to allostatic load, which may include autoimmune disease, but also hypertension, type 1 diabetes, and so forth, may be more likely to be associated with a fast life history strategy. Okay, now back to borderline personality disorder. I think I can rush through this, the first slides. You know that there are these 9 APA criteria: fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, identity disorder, and so forth, are typical or are diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder, 5 of which have to be present to arrive at a diagnosis according to DSM criteria, suggesting that there are at least 100 different phenotypes. So, in other words, 2 individuals may overlap in just one criteria and are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This is something we have to keep in mind when we speak about evolutionary approaches to psychopathological syndromes, which is, as we've heard before, different from somatic medicine, where we have more substantial biological facts that we can examine. You also know that the lifetime prevalence of borderline personality disorder is quite high in our Western populations, about 1 to 2, in some studies up to 6% in the general population. In psychiatric hospitals, it's much higher. At least 15% have a comorbid borderline personality disorder. There's quite a bit of debate whether there is a female to male ratio of 3 to 1 or maybe 4 to 1, or whether it's more equal to 1 to 1, and those male borderline patients are rather found in prisons rather than in hospitals. But that's a different story. I can't go into detail. We know that the onset is in adolescence or early adulthood, and at least 2/3 of people with borderline personality disorder have experienced some sort of childhood abuse or other sorts of early adversity. In our inpatient sample, it's much closer to 80 to 90%. Depression is very common. I would rather like to call this depressivity rather than depression, for reasons I will perhaps briefly have a chance to speak about. And the contribution of genetics of borderline personality disorder is still a bit inconclusive. Oh, that's terrible, because this, well, let me read it for you. This is I originally did a keynote presentation which doesn't work on this computer. So this is the PowerPoint version. So I would like to guide you through a couple of empirical studies that we carried out in the last couple of years. And one was using the so-called Birkbeck mating questionnaire developed by Jay Belsky and his doctoral student, Daniel Cohen, a couple of years ago. And goodness, this is not my presentation. Okay, so the Birkbeck mating questionnaire is a 32-item questionnaire where people have to respond to certain questions tapping into their mating preferences. And people get 3 different scenarios. One is a predictably risky scenario, one is a predictably unrisky or non-risky scenario or safe scenario, and the third one is somewhat in between. And this is the example for the predictably risky scenario. So imagine you are single, have no children, you left school early, you don't get along with your family, and family relations are distant and conflicted. You live in a dirty and noisy neighborhood. Community areas are not very well maintained and perhaps even dangerous. Your neighbors are generally unfriendly and so forth. You lost your job and you have a lot of unpaid bills. So that's in our modern kind of Western society a risky scenario where not a lion is behind you but other dangers that are threatening you. And the question is, now imagine you have, you're interested in having some kind of romantic relationship. It could be long-term or short-term or somewhere in between. And you have to decide what kind of mate you would prefer in such a situation. And this is the predictably safe scenario. So very similar in style compared to the other risky scenario. You are single, but you have a university degree, no children, parents, siblings are supportive, you live in a safe neighborhood, and so forth. Neighbors are okay, you have a stable job, and you will remain employed for the foreseeable future. And then same questions with regard to mate preference. How much commitment would you expect from potential mates? How early would you be willing to engage in sexual activity? Would you like to have children with him, etc., etc.? And we gave this questionnaire to a sample of people with borderline personality disorder and a control group. The 2 groups were originally larger than shown here, where we extracted 60 female patients with borderline personality disorder within an age range of 18 to 40. So we excluded all women older than 40 years and all male participants. So we ended up with 60 female patients, young patients, average age 24, and very similar age in the control group. And in addition to the questionnaire, we asked questions relating to somatic maturation. So we asked age at first menarche, first sexual intercourse, number of sexual affairs, and number of sexual partners in the past year. So these were, if participants were honest in answering these questions, real world data, so to speak. And as you can see here, no difference with regard to age at menarche, something I would like to discuss with you a little later, what implications this could have. But you see, there is already a significant difference in sexual risk-taking, as shown here by the much larger number of sexual affairs and number of sexual partners in the past year, which was higher in the borderline group compared to the control group. And we also gave a couple of questionnaires to the participants, including the childhood trauma questionnaire and another questionnaire which asked for the recalled parental rearing style. So how did participants experience paternal and maternal warmth, paternal and maternal rejection, and paternal and maternal overprotection? And you see that the two groups differed in every measure, including depressiveness, which was measured using the Beck's depression inventory. Now, first thing that we looked at was whether the overall model worked in the entire group. So we pooled the data of the borderline and the control participants. And in fact, what this table shows is that the model worked very well because higher scores here indicate slower life history. So you see, for example, that in terms of parental investment, which is the second row, the safer the environmental conditions, the more parental investment was expected from the hypothetical romantic partner. And with regard to the other factors, a similar picture emerged. There were higher scores for the predictably safe condition compared to the predictably risky condition, and the intermediate condition was somewhere in between. Okay. To our surprise, the borderline group and the control group differed very little in terms of their response patterns to the Birkbeck mating questionnaire. What we found is that people with female patients with borderline personality disorder expected less from their hypothetical partners in terms of parental investment in the predictably safe ecological condition, and they were willing to engage earlier in sexual intercourse across conditions. But this was all. There were no differences with regard to the other sub-factors. And this is a very tiny table where I would like to draw, if you can read it, your attention to the bottom row where we examined the number of sexual partners in the past year. And if you just look at the asterisks in the bottom row, you see that the number of sexual partners correlated significantly with adversity, and in fact all factors, like including sexual abuse, emotional neglect, and so forth, and also with harsh rejecting parenting style as a self-report measure, I have to say. And statistically, the overall model was really complicated because we had several factors interacting in ways that are shown here. So traumatization, as measured using the childhood trauma questionnaire, predicted depressiveness, measured by the Beck depression inventory. And this, again, was a predictor for the timing of the first sexual intercourse. And again, this predicted number of sexual partners, which was also predicted by the amount of experienced traumatization. So to summarize, it seems that what we found could support the idea that people with borderline personality disorder indeed follow a relatively fast life history strategy. Well, let me come back to the somatic maturation problem. Earlier work by Bruce Ellis and colleagues has shown that there is indeed variation in sexual maturation, but this depends actually on the genotype regarding the function of the autonomic nervous system. So this graph shows that there is, we've seen the model or the idea we've seen in Annie's talk called the differential susceptibility model, showing that there are girls who are unresponsive to environmental cues, indicated by the solid lines, who do not differ with regard to their sexual maturation, regardless whether they received high or low social support from their family. By contrast, another group of girls differed very much according to high or low familial support when they were more responsive in terms of the function of their autonomic nervous system. And this is shown by the dotted lines, where you see that the age of maturation differed by 3 years depending on this gene-environment interaction. And as said earlier, we did not find this in our borderline group compared to the control group, which may relate to the fact that, of course, this study may have been underpowered. As you could see, we had 60 patients in the borderline group compared to 45 in the control group, whereas Ellis and colleagues studied several hundreds of participants. But we were also wondering whether this could relate to the more general idea that people with borderline personality disorder have, at least females with borderline personality disorder, have more internalizing problems. In fact, Belsky and colleagues were arguing in that paper that internalizing problems may serve to lower metabolism, store fat, and thereby stimulate menarche. And so we were wondering if that could be a factor that interfered with our menarche data. So just in preparation of this talk, I reanalyzed the data in that regard, and I would like to focus on 3 issues here. So we've seen earlier that conscientiousness is an indicator of a slow life history strategy. So high conscientiousness is more likely to occur in people following a slow strategy, whereas externalizing oriented thinking is the opposite. The more externalizing oriented thinking, the faster the life history strategy might be. And in addition, we looked at fears of compassion, a scale that was developed by Professor Paul Gilbert, where we measured how people would experience compassion for themselves. And as you can see here, there were significant differences between the borderline and the control group in regard of conscientiousness, which was lower in the borderline group. Externalizing oriented thinking is a sub-factor of the Toronto alexithymia scale, which is higher here in the borderline group. And fears of compassion were much higher. Compassion for oneself was much higher in the borderline group. And we related these 3 factors to the age at onset of menarche and found, in support of the general idea that conscientiousness correlates with the age of menarche. So in other words, the more conscientious a person is, the later the onset of menarche is, which is compatible with the fast, slow, dimensional idea. Same thing for the externalizing oriented thinking style, where the correlation was inverse, of course, and also compatible with the fear of compassion for oneself, which was also negatively correlated with the age of menarche. We also correlated age of menarche with actual height, and found a significant correlation, which is also in support of the idea that early menarche is related to faster somatic maturation. And you see here in the table there is a lot of intercorrelation between these other factors, where conscientiousness also correlated inversely with the experience of adversity, the quality of recalled upbringing, risk-taking, and so forth. And the best statistical, though very modest, predictor of menarche was actually the factor conscientiousness, which, as you know, is one of the 5 factors of the 5-factor personality model. I have to say here that there was, as I said earlier, there was no distinction between the borderline and the control group, so this was pooled for the whole sample. I think I have still a couple of minutes to develop another idea. So next step is to look at behavioral genetics and gene-environment interaction. I would like to show you a couple of additional slides where we develop the following idea. Empathy, as you may recall from Marco Del Giudice's table, is also something related to the fast-slow spectrum. So more empathy is more related to a slow life history strategy. And we were interested in the question whether people with borderline personality disorder would differentially respond to a scenario where a person is exposed to a physical pain, shown above, where hot coffee is accidentally poured over the girl's hand. Second image depicts a psychological painful situation, and the third one shows a neutral situation. And we were interested whether people with borderline personality disorder would respond to physical and psychological pain differentially in comparison to healthy control subjects. And indeed, what we found is that they did respond in a different way, especially when asked to put themselves into the shoes of that woman depicted in the situation. So from a first-person perspective, the identification, as I would like to call it, with psychological pain was higher in the borderline group compared to the control group, where in the physical pain condition, from a first-person perspective, there was no difference. Viewed from a third-person perspective, where people had to answer, what do you think that girl in the situation is feeling, we found the opposite. We found actually the same pattern where people with borderline personality disorder rated the pain higher than the controls. And again, this was in a statistical model related to the experience of early adversity, but also related to alexithymia, especially difficulties identifying emotions. So interestingly, there was no direct route from the experience of early adversity to the empathy for psychological pain, but it was mediated by the ability to identify own emotions as measured using the Toronto alexithymia scale. Now, very recent research looked at polymorphic variation at the oxytocin receptor gene. As you know, oxytocin is a powerful, though biologically very simple nonapeptide, which is not only important for parturition and lactation, but also for social communication. And there has been very nice research in mainly in autistic people showing that polymorphic variation relates to the ability of autistic people to socially connect with others. And we looked at one such polymorphism and found in support of, again, the differential susceptibility model that there was a difference between carriers of the GG genotype compared to carriers who had at least one A allele in the oxytocin receptor gene with regard to the ability to empathize with others who were exposed to psychological pain. And the differential effect was mediated by the experience of childhood maltreatment, showing that in cases with high childhood maltreatment, there was actually more empathy for another's psychological pain in GA or AA carriers, whereas the GG carriers were apparently less responsive to the environmental effect of adversity. And on the right-hand side, you see this summarized in a statistical model. But again, contrary to expectations, there was no difference between the borderline group and the control group with regard to the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and distribution of the genotypes. So originally we expected that the more plastic genotype would be more prevalent in the borderline group compared to the control group, which was not the case. So the distribution was equal in these two groups. So I recognize this was a lot of complicated stuff, and I would like to summarize the findings with two take-home messages. I think we can say that ecological contingencies during early developmental stages seem to have an imprinting-like effect on how individuals experience and interact with their social environments, and on the way people make, of course, unconscious predictions about what to expect from the future. And their expectations may actually influence the way they choose sexual partners and perhaps the amount of investment in their own children. This is a very technical term, so childcare. So, in other words, through the lens of life history theory, the behavior of people with BPD is consistent with their expectations, and it's perhaps only dysfunctional by means of context. The context is defined by the clinician. We think the environment is safe, so why do you pursue a fast strategy? But from their perspective and their perception, the environment is not safe, so it's consistent with their view of the world, and I think we can use this therapeutically in psychodynamic or other kinds of psychotherapy. So, and this is my second take-home message, I would think that therapeutic approaches to personality disorders, perhaps particularly borderline personality disorder, might include talking about these insights from life history theory. Specifically, insight-oriented treatment may encourage individuals to reflect upon their own behavior, taking into account early attachment experiences, their exposure to adversity, and how this may have shaped their ways of mating and parenting. And we may also consider that this approach could also help to reduce the transgenerational transmission of such maladaptive behaviors and improve mental health. So I think that was my last slide. Here are a couple of colleagues who worked with me on the different projects, and I would like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brüne. So it seems like you're saying that the fast life history strategy presumably may have been adaptive in the environment of the evolutionary adaptiveness for us. So it evolved when it was adaptive, and now you're questioning to what extent is it adaptive in the current context. So there's a question of, do we have a mismatch, or is it possible that that behavior may still be adaptive in the current context?
Yeah, so the question is whether fast life history strategies were once adaptive in our evolutionary history, and if there are environmental contextual contexts where it could be still adaptive, right? I believe this is a very difficult question because the presumption is that our environments of evolutionary adaptiveness were very dangerous. This is perhaps not true as it appears at first sight. So if you consider that we lived in very small and close-knit social communities where everybody was personally known to the other, it might be that the dangers were even less than today, where we live in anonymous and social environments. At least the dangers were different, like more infectious diseases, perhaps predators, but not so much social dangers. So I would question that this presumption is correct. And I would also like to argue that it's the plasticity that evolved to pursue both either the fast or slow strategy, depending on the context. So I would think that every one of us could switch to some degree his or her strategy depending on the current context. So apparently we live in quite safe environmental conditions today, but consider the situation during World War II, where our parents or grandparents were exposed to a very dangerous environment, and they may have behaved in very different ways, or maybe their behavior may have been guided to a different strategy. And there is, of course, no genetic effect, because this is impossible to change within 1 or 2 generations. So I think that the question is very good, but very difficult to answer.
Riyad, do you want to start?
There was a paper published in Biological Letters in the last few months, 2-3 months, which we reviewed actually in the current newsletter, EPSIG newsletter, and was by a guy called Daniel Smith, who I believe is a psychologist in Bristol, and he looked at the question of father absence as opposed to the presence of step siblings in the family. And what he found was that the age of menarche was influenced by the presence of step siblings and not father absence. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, my first question would be...
His explanation is that it's kin selection
Right.
that matters rather than prediction of adversity. This is his argument that the ability to invest in related kin seems to have a delaying effect on menarche, yeah, rather than the prediction of adversity. So this was his hypothesis, that he was testing whether it is the prediction of adversity or whether it is the ability to invest in kin.
So the question is whether the presence of stepchildren has an influence on somatic maturation.
So there are children from other marriage that when two families get together. And so
okay,
it's not half siblings.
so a patchwork family,
Yes,
so to speak.
yes.
Right. It's very difficult to comment on it.
But I can send you the letter.
But does this really contradict the idea that there is a spectrum of fast, slow strategies?
No, it doesn't. But it just puts a more complicated, a more complex explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a predictive strategy. It is also, well, I guess even kin selection is a predictive strategy as well, because if you predict that you will not be able to invest in kin, that might be a reason to reproduce early. I don't know. I mean,
I mean, we know that the presence of a stepfather is associated often with more violence in families, which should accelerate somatic maturation. At least in girls, it's less clear for boys. But maybe having children from that stepfather in the family precludes violent interaction with the father's stepchildren. That could be
I mean, it's just
an ad hoc explanation or attempt to explain this.
And as I think you mentioned before, Riyad, it shows the importance in evolutionary psychiatry of developing a hypothesis and then testing it, and then you can actually develop new hypotheses depending upon those findings.
Absolutely, and without the evolutionary perspective, you can't even ask the question.
Exactly. Mohammed, just behind.
Many thanks, Martin. I find the fast life history hypothesis of borderline person very interesting and reasonably convincing. My question is, we know that the severity of symptoms of borderline personality disorder get less with time, and usually the prognosis is not that bad as people think. Does that, again, support the fast life history in that with time, the productivity, with age, the chance of producing children, etc., will be less?
I think so, yes. But if you look at what improves over time, even without therapy, what improves in borderline patients, even without therapy, is impulsivity, but not so much the interpersonal problems. Social functioning does not improve over time without therapy. It's number of affairs and impulsivity. That's right. And this is one of the reasons why we excluded women older than 40 years from the analysis, because we wanted a sample of sexually fertile women. And it might be a different story in older women, I agree, but it does not contradict the fast, slow, or maybe even it's supportive of the idea. Yeah.
And another question over there on the side.
Thank you, Martin. Is there any population level evidence from cohort studies with regards to fast life hypothesis in borderline patients?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not aware of any population-based studies.
This is research.
Yeah, would be very nice to have. Yeah.
All right. So that was
Okay.
Indirectly, there is some there is some research on teenage pregnancy, which is a hotly debated topic in the United Kingdom. At present, a little less in continental Europe, as far as I can see. But I believe there are sub-threshold borderline features in teenage pregnancy girls, like heightened impulsivity, emotion dysregulation, and so forth. And there is quite good research on that.
So the second question is...
I think we'll have to leave it at that for the moment. The questioner just a bit further behind. Yes.
Thank you. Well, what about their suicidal behavior? Persons with personality, borderline personality disorder are often highly suicidal. It seems to contradict what you just have been talking about.
The question is whether the high prevalence of suicidal behavior in borderline personality disorder would contradict the idea of the fast life history strategy. In my view, it does not contradict these interpretations. Personally, I find it very difficult to assign a single one meaning to the high prevalence of suicide attempts in people with borderline personality disorder. In my view, it has very often a function of getting social support from significant others. This does not preclude that sometimes these suicide attempts are very serious. But along similar lines, the self-cutting, I believe, in many cases has a meaning and is a signal to the social environment to ask for support. And in fact, this, if I may call this for a moment manipulative behavior, it would be very much supportive in favor of the fast life history idea, because manipulativeness is something that is at the core of borderline personality disorder, and to, in a different way, also what Alfonso has published on antisocial personality, not just disorder, but antisocial personality. These guys are also very, very manipulative socially, not in terms of suicidal or self-injurious behavior, not so much, but I think in borderline it's a social signal.
There's another question at the front there.
It seems to me that in the narrative of patients with borderline personality disorder, there's a narrative often of trauma. And I suppose what I'm interested in is where the concept of resilience fits into your model, because I suppose that's one of the things we want to look at, isn't it? Actually how resilient people, because we do know people who have enormous adversity and actually develop resilience.
Yeah. I think we need to distinguish several types of resilience. There is apparently a genetic resilience, a genetic unresponsiveness to environmental circumstances, as I've shown using the example of the oxytocin receptor polymorphism, but there is more evidence with regard to other genetic polymorphisms. And I think another thing is psychological resilience, and the question, how can we improve or stabilize people who were exposed to traumatic events during childhood, and how can we make them cope with adversity and make them more resilient. But I think this is a different question. Of course, nobody can change his or her genotype, but I think we have psychological means of stabilizing and improving resilience. I would think more by psychotherapeutic means rather than medication, but maybe in some cases by a combination.
Okay. Two more questions at the front here.
Hey, thanks for that talk. It's really interesting. So, with regards to life history traits, I know time of maturation is often determined by early life adversity, but some of the behavioural characteristics have been shown to be able to be primed just through short-term exposure to cues of environmental harshness. So I was wondering, with borderline BPD, where a lot of the symptoms you're talking about are behavioural, to what extent you think this could be plastic in response to current conditions even in adulthood as opposed to just childhood adversity, given that some experiments show future discounting, for example, can be experimentally induced to change very quickly even in adulthood.
The question is whether exposure, if I got it right, exposure to trauma during adulthood can lead to different consequences as opposed to childhood trauma. Is that?
I guess whether certain behavioural aspects of BPD are solely determined by childhood environments, or whether actually conditions in adulthood can induce them as well, given that other research shows that things like impulsivity and future discounting can be changed in adulthood, in adult experimental participants just through short-term exposure to cues of harshness.
I see. So I think, yes, it can. So experience of traumatic events in adulthood can have similar consequences behaviorally. My guess is especially in those who are genetically plastic.
But what about the reverse, for people who had childhood adversity in adulthood have fairly stable environments? Do you notice that the BPD symptoms can stop?
Mm-hmm. So the question is whether or not life history strategies can change over lifetime. Is that a good summary of the question? So I think this is a very important question, because all we would like to do is slow down one's life history strategy in people who, from our clinical perspective, pursue a strategy that is inadequate in our contextual environment, and it would be very sad if that was not possible. So, in a larger view, the question also, involves the question of whether we can achieve real recovery, not just remission, but recovery. And I'm a bit more skeptical about that, because it seems that there is still kind of vulnerability in the stress system, also after successful therapy. So if such a person encounters another adverse event, it may worsen the situation again. So, but very interesting question.
Final two questions, one there and one over here.
I just wanted to make a couple of points about resilience and suicide. Martin Teicher from Harvard has summarized research on brain imaging and abuse in Child Psychology and Psychiatry and Nature Reviews Neuroscience. And he makes the point that the changes he sees in the brain are the adaptive resilience. And not everyone that gets brain changes actually gets disorder, but it provides vulnerability in the future to getting a disorder. So the resilience is part of the changes, but it does provide vulnerability later on. The other thing I would say about suicidal behavior, and we always talk about the past, but we also need to talk about the future, hope. Suicidal behavior sometimes is about transcendence. It's about trying to find hope into something. If you look at the people that jumped from the Golden Bridge in San Francisco, they experienced and were looking for transient, for something that would give them hope in their misery.
Hello.
this between the fast and slow life history, the number of offsprings they produce, are there any big difference or is it significant? So is that showing some kind of a selection or species propagation, that level of ideas? Have you thought about that?
The question is whether a fast life history strategy in that clinical sample paid off reproductively, right? Very good question. I don't have data for that sample, but my clinical observation is that a lot of young women with borderline personality disorder have given birth to several children in their early 20s, and many of them from different fathers. So the first idea would be, okay, it pays off reproductively, but I think this is a bit short-sighted in a way, because from an evolutionary point of view, you have to take into account the F2, 3, 4 generation, which is grandchildren and next generations, and I would be very skeptical to propose that it pays off reproductively. Maybe in the first generation, but in light of our tremendous amount of parental investment that we usually have to invest in our children, I think the fast strategy is not a good strategy in our safe environments, because often these kids are socially disadvantaged, taken out of the family or away from the mother, in foster care and so forth. Yeah, I think that's my answer to that question.
Okay, well, thank you very much then, Professor Brüne,
Thank
for a
you.
really very
Thank
interesting talk.